Marijuana. It's been a subject of interest for over 6,000 years. It's been used as a medicine, cooking oil, and a livestock food supplement. Many believe it is a menace to society, while others say it's no more harmful than an occasional drink of alcohol. As a medicine, proponents say the use of marijuana helps lessen the pain and nausea associated with cancer. They also testify that it stimulates appetite in AIDS patients. Marijuana may help to prevent glaucoma and epileptic seizures, and has been shown to reduce muscle pain and spasms for those suffering from multiple sclerosis. THC is the active ingredient responsible for most of marijuana's medicinal qualities. Opponents say THC can promote negative psychological reactions such as panic attacks, anxiety, and hallucinations. And they say its continued use causes long-term damage to memory functions in the human brain. Then there's evidence that smoking marijuana, like cigarettes, may cause cancer. Whatever the argument, marijuana has been outlawed in the United States since 1937. And except for a handful of states conducting further medicinal research, possession, cultivation, and selling marijuana remains illegal. Why does this controversy remain? Is marijuana truly dangerous? And how does the marijuana of today differ from 60 years ago? We discussed these issues with Eric Martin, one of the nation's leading authorities on the subject of marijuana. Eric is the director of the Addiction Counselor Certification Board of Oregon and has 17 years' experience as an addiction treatment counselor. Eric has agreed to answer these and other questions based on data collected by a number of reputable scientific investigations. He begins by answering these questions. What is new marijuana? Isn't it the same as it's always been?
In the 1970s, growers would typically have a grow operation outdoors where they would plant a bunch of seeds in the ground, and they would have both male and female plants growing. Once they detected which plants were male, they would rip the male plants out of the environment. Then those female buds would exude resin, hoping male pollen was going to come stick to it. And the female buds would exude more resin and more resin, hoping male pollen would come stick to it, but it never did. And what the grower was left with was this very sticky, unpollinated, and now seedless bud. And they used to call that marijuana bud sinsemilla. So through artificial behavior, they were able to create more THC by causing the female bud to produce more resin and no seeds. Well, around 1980, growers began moving their grow operations indoors. They started using hydroponics, they started using chemicals, fertilizers, nitrogen, and even one chemical that's actually dangerous to humans known as colchicine. Colchicine was used in the grafting process and by unethical marijuana growers that would like to increase the potency of their marijuana plants and the yield. Colchicine is dangerous to humans, it can cause kidney damage, and there's been a number of recorded deaths in California from colchicine poisoning, from smoking too much marijuana that had been grown using colchicine. So growers began this artificial behavior, they began using chemicals, they began using hydroponics, and they stopped growing male plants altogether. So what they started to do is take clippings from their highest THC potency female plants, and they called that process cloning, when they would sprout clippings from their highest THC potency female plants, and then they called that generations. Generations of cloning produced higher THC plants. Growers in Canada and the Netherlands, around 1985 or so, began genetic engineering of marijuana. But as the potency of THC increases, the actual structure, the amount of cannabinoids, because there are other cannabinoids in marijuana beyond THC, that structure is starting to change. So, after all of this genetic manipulation, artificial sunlight up to 20 hours a day, artificial behavior, and buckets of chemicals, people sit back and say that they smoke it because it's natural. But this marijuana is far from natural. There's three types of cannabis: Cannabis ruderalis, Cannabis indica, and Cannabis sativa. Cannabis ruderalis is a short, bushy plant that grows primarily in northern Asia, and it actually has the least amount of THC, and THC is the active, psychoactive drug that's in marijuana. Next is Cannabis indica and Cannabis sativa. Now, in their natural state, Cannabis indica and Cannabis sativa have approximately about the same amount of THC. Actually, they're about 1% THC in nature. Now, it's true that George Washington grew marijuana. It was actually his preference to grow Cannabis indica over sativa. Sativa was already growing here. It still grows wild throughout the U.S. The Northridge Indian Reservation literally has square miles of Cannabis sativa growing. But the truth of the matter is hardly anybody ever takes any natural sativa, largely because they don't get that high off of it. Most chronic marijuana users, or we could say marijuana addicts, even though oftentimes they say they smoke marijuana because it's natural, the truth is they hate natural marijuana.
How many have tried marijuana, and what's the addiction rate?
According to the National Household Survey, about 33% of Americans have tried marijuana at some point during their lifetime. About 5% report being past month users, and about 1% of the population reports chronic daily or near daily use of marijuana.
I've heard that continued use of crystal bud is not much different from natural marijuana.
As these bracteal heads produce more and more of this resin or tar, they produce such a volume through all of these artificial processes that they can no longer contain it. They crack open, it touches molecules in the air and crystallizes. Kind of the way that sap running out of the side of a tree would crystallize on the exterior of the tree. Then the buds become caked in white crystals. Around 1990, addiction treatment professionals, preventionists, and alcohol and drug educators weren't aware of what was happening with marijuana in regards to genetics and all the artificial processes that were occurring with it to increase its potency. So clients started coming into treatment services saying that they had smoked this marijuana bud that had white crystals on the outside of it. And these treatment professionals, unaware of what was happening with marijuana, said, well, that sounds like that might have been laced with PCP, or that might have been laced with cocaine, or that might have been laced with methamphetamine, because they were unaware of what was happening, that was the new marijuana. The new marijuana was caked with crystals, and now they call it crystally bud, the users. So we passed on this unfortunate meta message about 10 years ago to thousands of people that were coming through addiction treatment services in the early 1990s. And that sad meta message was, you better be careful because someday you might accidentally use a real drug. As if marijuana was not a real drug. Well, the truth of the matter is that marijuana growers are not sitting around with buckets of drugs painting PCP and meth and coke all over marijuana buds. This is the new marijuana, white crystally bud.
What problems can marijuana cause in humans?
THC crosses the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is essentially an extra layer of glial cells surrounding the arteries going into the brain. It's like an extra sheath of skin or tissue around the arteries going into the brain. And the blood-brain barrier protects the brain against poisons, viruses, bacteria, etc. But THC crosses the blood-brain barrier. A lot of drugs of abuse cross the blood-brain barrier. Now, THC is molecularly similar to one of your brain's natural neurotransmitters known as anandamide. Now, one of the exercises that I have clients do is to try and figure out what is anandamide. If you look at the picture, you can see that anandamide and THC look very close. Their molecular shape is extremely close. And both anandamide and THC fit into anandamide receptors in the brain. So, if you know what THC does, you can figure out what anandamide does. And when you smoke marijuana, you're tinkering with this natural system. Now, what we also know about drugs of abuse is that they activate a part of the brain known as the nucleus accumbens, or the pleasure and reward center of the brain. We know that this is the one and only thing that all drugs of abuse have in common. They all do diverse things in the body. Some increase heart rate and respiration, some drugs of abuse lower heart rate and respiration. The one thin thread that binds them together pharmacologically is that they all increase dopamine activity in the pleasure and reward circuit of the brain. Science now knows that this is the reinforcing mechanism of drugs of abuse, that they cause euphoria in these pleasure and reward centers. Researchers have actually been able to look at the amount of pleasure that's caused by certain process behaviors like eating and sex compared to the amount of pleasure that is evoked by drugs of abuse. They've actually been able to measure dopamine levels in the nucleus accumbens of the brain. Now, a researcher named DiChiara and co-workers looked at the amount of pleasure evoked by food, and food came in at a level of about 150. Sex came in at a level of about 200. Amphetamine came in at a level of about 1,050. Cocaine came in at a level of about 340. Nicotine from cigarettes came in at a level of about 225. And morphine, which isn't nearly as strong as heroin, came in at a level of about 200. So as you can see, drugs evoke more euphoria in the pleasure and reward circuits of the brain than natural rewards like food and sex. But what's important to understand is that drugs don't cause highs. Drugs cause the release of highs. The high was already in your brain to begin with. The drug just caused dopamine to be released. With really strong forms of marijuana, we see significant increases in dopamine as well. Now, we haven't measured marijuana as yet, and we don't have an exact number at this time. But we know from the experiences of users that when they smoke stronger forms of marijuana, that they actually get an increase in elevation in heart rate and respiration, which would be typical of an elevation of dopamine. So when dopamine levels increase, users report that when they smoke really strong forms of marijuana, it makes their heart go thump, that they actually get an increase in heart rate and respiration. And nowadays, we get a lot of young folks in treatment saying that they smoke marijuana and go out and play basketball for an hour and things along those lines. If you told somebody back in the 1960s or 70s that, hey, you want to go get stoned and play basketball or run a marathon, people would look at you like you were crazy. Because marijuana back in the 60s and 70s really was more like natural marijuana, and it did not cause that significant euphoria that users now experience from genetically engineered Frankenweed. THC from marijuana is toxic. Now, make no mistake, sometimes users are ambivalent about this information, but make no mistake, all drugs of abuse are toxic. All drugs of abuse. Even caffeine causes breakages in chromosomes in white blood cells. Really, the question is how toxic is THC compared to other drugs? But is it toxic or not? Yes, it is absolutely toxic. Anandamide, the brain's natural THC, is not toxic. It is a non-toxic chemical produced by the brain. But here's the kicker, is that when a person smokes marijuana for a sustained period of time, their brain stops making anandamide. Their brain stops making its own natural THC. This is true with all the drugs of abuse. That's the reason that when a person quits using stimulant drugs, they're very tired and lethargic and depressed for a long time. When a person quits using opiate drugs, they experience a lot of pain because they don't have those natural pain relief